Welcome to the Sex Science Podcast, where we turn the latest peer-reviewed research on intimacy and sexuality into fun, accessible conversations. Generated by AI and fact-checked by experts, the Sex Science Podcast was created by LaShaw to empower you through knowledge. So, join us as we explore pleasure, relationships, human connection, and everything in between.
We often think about, what drives intimacy in couples. Is it just about how much each person desires it?
Right, like a simple case of individual desire.
Exactly. But what if it's, more complex than that? What if things like traditional gender roles are sort of subtly shaping things?
Mm-hmm. Shaping not just how often couples connect, but maybe even the desire itself.
That's what we're digging into today. We're looking at a really fascinating study that tries to untangle these hidden influences.
Yeah, it's a great one. The study's called Rights or Obligations, the extent to which sexual desire and gender roles determine sexual intimacy in romantic relationships. It's from the Journal of Sex and Marital Therapy.
Rights or obligations.
Okay. And it's not just looking at personal preference. It's really about how our beliefs, about being a man or a woman in a relationship connect to our own desire, and importantly, how much desire we think our partner has.
And how that all links to how often sex actually happens.
Precisely. So our goal here is to kind of uncover those surprising links, the things we often just assume about relationships.
Okay, let's jump right in then. When the researchers first crunched the numbers, what were some of the big picture findings?
Well, one of the first things I noticed was that, generally speaking, the men in the study reported higher levels of sexual desire.
Okay.
And they also reported having sex more frequently compared to the women.
Which I guess might fit some common stereotypes, right? But the researchers didn't just stop there, did they?
No, not at all. They were pretty sharp about considering potential reporting bias.
Right. Like maybe social norms influence what people feel comfortable saying.
Exactly. It's possible men feel more, pressure to sound like they have a really high sex drive. But here's something interesting.
Yeah.
When they asked about perceived desire, so how much people thought their partner wanted sex, those gender differences kind of disappeared.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So no significant difference in how much men thought their female partners wanted it versus how much women thought their male partners wanted it.
Pretty much. On average, both men and women seem to think their partners desired intimacy at a similar level.
That's a really important distinction. So even if men said they wanted it more and did it more, they generally felt their partners were sort of on the same page, desire-wise? Okay, now let's get into something that really caught my eye. Traditional gender roles. What happened when the study factored those in?
This is where it gets really fascinating, I think. The study found that people who held stronger beliefs in traditional gender roles.
And how did they define those roles, just quickly?
Good question. Basically, the classic idea. Men as the main providers, the decision makers, and women as the primary caretakers responsible for the home.
Got it. So people who strongly believed in that setup.
They actually reported lower levels of their own personal sexual desire.
Wait, lower? Really? That seems kind of backwards compared to some stereotypes, doesn't it?
It really does. And it was especially noticeable for the men. Guys who leaned more conservative on gender roles. Lower reported sexual desire.
Wow. That definitely challenges some common assumptions.
But here's the kicker, the real twist.
Yep.
Despite reporting lower personal desire, both the men and the women who are more traditional reported engaging in sexual activity more often.
Hold on. Lower desire, but more sex. That feels like a contradiction. How did they explain that?
Well, the researchers suggested this might point towards a feeling of booty or obligation within the relationship.
The obligation's part of the title.
Exactly. Especially when those traditional roles are really strong, sex might become less about spontaneous mutual desire and more like, something that's expected, part of fulfilling the role,
That makes a certain kind of sense, even if it's a bit sobering. Okay, let's shift gears slightly. The study also looked at what actually drives the frequency of sex for men versus women. Were there differences there?
Oh, definitely. And this is pretty key. For the men in the study, the biggest factor linked to how often they had sex was their own reported level of sexual desire.
Okay, so if a man said he wanted sex more, they generally had sex more often. Seems logical enough.
Right. Fairly straightforward for men.
And for women, was it the same? Their own desire driving frequency?
Not quite. For women, the frequency of sex was more strongly tied to how much they perceived their partner wanted sex.
So it wasn't primarily about her own level of desire, but more about what she thought her partner wanted.
That's what the data suggests. If a woman believed her partner had a strong desire, they tended to have sex more often, potentially even if her own reported desire wasn't as high at that moment.
Interesting. It sounds like women might be perhaps more attuned or responsive to their partner's perceived needs in deciding when to be intimate.
That's one interpretation, yeah. It suggests that, at least in this group, the man's desire might often be setting the pace, so to speak.
It seems like men's desire carries more weight in determining the frequency then.
That seems to be a pattern the study points to. But again, it gets even more layered when you bring those traditional gender role beliefs back into the mix.
Okay, let's unpack that connection. How did traditional views change the way desire linked up with frequency for men and women?
Okay, so for men who did not strongly endorse traditional gender roles, the less traditional guys the researchers saw a stronger connection between the man's own desire and his perception of his partner's desire.
Meaning?
It suggests maybe more alignment, more tuning in to each other's desires in those less traditional relationships, like, I want it, and I also sense you want it too.
Right, a more mutual vibe, perhaps? And what about the men who did hold strong traditional views?
For them, that alignment wasn't really there in the data. Their own desire seemed to predict frequency, but it wasn't as connected to what they thought their partner wanted. It operated more independently.
Huh. So maybe less focus on the partner's perceived desire as a factor for them. What about the women? How did traditional beliefs affect them?
This was a really striking finding. For women who strongly agreed with traditional gender roles, get this, their own sexual desire had almost no significant statistical link to how often they had sex.
None. Seriously.
Practically none. For these women, the main driver was their perception of their partner's desire. If she thought he wanted it, that was the key factor predicting frequency, seemingly regardless of her own feelings at the time.
Wow. That really highlights the potential obligation aspect we talked about.
It certainly seems to. Now, for women who were less traditional in their views, there was a link between their own desire and frequency. So their desire mattered more than for the highly traditional women.
Okay, so their own desire did play a role if they were less traditional.
Yes, but even for these less traditional women, their perception of their partner's desire was still a stronger predictor of sexual frequency than their own desire was.
So across the board for women in this study, partners' perceived desire was a major factor, but it was almost the only factor for those in very traditional setups.
That's a good summary. It really suggests that in relationships where traditional roles are more dominant, the male partner might implicitly or explicitly have more say in when intimacy happens.
That points to a definite power dynamic shaped by these beliefs. Now, you mentioned the specific group studied. Can you remind us about the context?
Right. Important detail. This study was done in Israel, and the participants were quite diverse: Jewish, Muslim, Druze, Christian. They also varied a lot in how religious or traditional they were.
And did these findings hold up across those different groups?
The researchers specifically checked if the patterns were the same when looking only at the heterosexual participants, and yes, the main findings held. So it suggests these dynamics related to gender roles were present across that varied sample.
Okay, now, no study is perfect, right? We always need to think about limitations. What did the researchers themselves point out?
Good point. They mentioned several things. First, it's cross-sectional, like a snapshot in time.
So you can see correlations, but you can't say for sure what causes what.
Exactly. Do traditional views cause lower desire, or is it something else? You'd need a study over time to figure that out. Second, it's all self-report.
Meaning, it depends on what people are willing or able to share accurately. Social desirability bias, memory, interpretation.
All those things. Plus, they only got data from one partner in each relationship, so you don't see the couple's interaction, just one person's perspective.
Right, you missed the other side of the story.
And lastly, the way they measured sexual desire was pretty simple, just a 3-point scale. Desire is complex. Maybe that scale didn't capture all the nuances.
Those are definitely important caveats. So, keeping those limitations in mind, what are the practical takeaways here? What could this mean for couples or maybe therapists working with couples?
Well, for therapists, it really highlights how crucial it is to talk about gender roles when dealing with sexual issues. It's not always just about mismatched libidos, you know?
Yeah, these underlying beliefs might be a huge factor.
Definitely. Therapy could involve helping couples examine these scripts, maybe challenge some traditional norms if they're causing issues, and really work on open communication about desire and consent.
and maybe helping people, particularly women in more traditional dynamics, identify if sex feels more like an obligation.
Precisely. Addressing that feeling, emphasizing mutual consent, enthusiastic agreement, and really supporting women's sexual agency, feeling empowered in their own sexuality.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big idea, the main thing to remember from this study?
I think the core message is just how deeply intertwined everything is. Societal gender expectations, our personal desire, how we read our partner's desire, and the actual frequency of intimacy.
It's not just about individual drive operating in a bubble.
Not at all. These invisible gender scripts can really shape the landscape of our intimate lives in ways we might not even realize.
That's a really powerful thought. So maybe a final question for you, the listener, to chew on. How might these unspoken rules about gender be playing out in your own life, in your own understanding or experience of intimacy?
Yeah, and what happens when those scripts get challenged or maybe consciously rewritten?
It definitely makes you think about that balance, right, between rights and obligations in our closest relationships. Thanks for exploring this deep dive with us.
Thank you for listening to the Sex Science Podcast brought to you by LaSha. We hope that you learned something new about the wonderful world of human intimacy and sexuality, and join us next time as we dive into more fascinating research. And remember, science is for you. Music for this podcast was produced by SOUNDRAW.